Es un gusto estar acá con ustedes en esta nueva edición de Pensadores Contemporáneos. Yo soy Paulina Rivero Weber y es un gusto presentarles al doctor Frans de Waal. Bueno, como ustedes saben, el doctor es el más connotado biólogo, etólogo y primatólogo del mundo y está aquí con nosotros para hablarnos de su obra. Frans, thank you for being here with us at the University of the People. And first of all, I would like to ask you, can you define yourself? How would you define yourself as a biologist, as a psychologist? Tell us about it.
I am a biologist from the Netherlands. I got my training in Utrecht. Then I moved in 1981 to the United States. Since that time, I work mostly as a psychologist.
Okay.
But my training is in biology and etology,
Okay.
Of animal behavior, basically.
In animal behavior.
Yeah.
Okay. Now tell us, how did you become interested in this field? When you were young, what happened there?
I've always been interested in animals. As a child, I always had animals. I had mostly fish and frogs and aquatic animals, but I also had birds.
You love aquatic animals, right?
Yeah, I still have a lot of fish. But I also liked, I had jackdaws, which are little birds, corvids, cats, mice, all sorts of animals. And so then later when I was 17, I moved to the university. Initially, I did not want to study biology because I had a very bad biology teacher at school. And I hated the man. But my mother said, no, you have always had animals, you should do biology. And which was a good decision because I don't think I would have been happy outside biology. So then I studied biology in several universities in the Netherlands and ended up with the primates, but the primates came later. So that's a sort of secondary choice. I could also have worked with birds or with frogs, or I like all sorts of animals, but I ended up as the primate.
And when you studied biology, didn't it happen to you that you should begin to experiment with them? And because many people who study biology for the love of animals, that happens usually, that you have to begin to kill animals. So.
Yeah, no, I didn't like that. I was one time in a lab where they did rat research, and at the end of the research, the rats had to be killed. And that's where I said, no, I did that for half a year, but I told the professor, I don't like this, I want to do something else. So I've never liked that idea, and experimentation with animals is something that I started doing much later in my life, and then mostly behavioral experimentation, so not electrodes or not invasive procedures.
And did you have any problem with your university or the professor when you said, I don't want to do this?
No, they respected that. And I think nowadays I sometimes meet students who say these things. We ought to respect that. That is their choice. It of course limits what you can do. There's certain things you cannot do if you do that. But I think that ought to be respected.
Okay. So you didn't have a problem. And we're talking about what year?
That was in the 1970s.
70s.
So that is, 50 years ago?
And they respected your decision.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. I really want to ask you, at the beginning of your work in Politics of the Chimpanzee, it seemed that you found that chimpanzees and human beings are very aggressive, that we all are very aggressive. So it was for me rather strange to find out that then you wrote Good Nature, a book in which it seems that you find exactly the opposite, that we humans and animals have a good nature.
Yeah.
So what happened there, and what would you say now? Do we have a good nature? Do we have an aggressive nature? What would you say?
Well, my first book, which was on chimpanzee politics, was about power struggles, and yes, aggressive behavior was very common. And actually, in those days, the only thing we could study was aggressive behavior, because Konrad Lorenz had written a book on aggression,
Yes.
and all the scientists were following, doing studies on aggression in rats, in chimpanzees, in all fish, all sorts of animals.
What do you think about that book? Let me ask you.
Lorenz's book,
On aggression.
I think it had good elements, because it was interesting to connect human behavior with animal behavior, but it also had a lot of problematic elements. But Lorenz wrote very well. He was a much better writer than most scientists, and that's why the book became so extremely popular, because he sort of said that we have an aggressive instinct. And of course, many people also objected to it, because he was an Austrian who had served in the German army during the war, and for him to say we have an aggressive instinct and that explains our behavior was not accepted by everyone. So it was a very problematic book, but many scientists started to follow and study aggressive behavior. And I was one of the young scientists my task was to study aggressive behavior in chimpanzees. But if you read Chimpanzee Politics carefully, you will see that in many parts I mentioned that the chimpanzees resolve their conflicts, they reconcile after fights, they console each other. So all these elements of positive behavior were already present in Chimpanzee Politics, which was more about the social strategies of the male chimpanzees. And so when I stepped in good natured towards more talking about peacemaking, my book following Chimpanzee Politics was Peacemaking Among Primates. And then after that I wrote Good Natured, which is about, let's say, empathy in primates.
And in bats and in elephants?
And in all sorts of other animals, yes. And those elements were all already present in Chimpanzee Politics, but now I moved more towards this. And the interesting thing is that I did that on the basis of an incident that happened at the Arnhem Zoo. I worked at that zoo until 1981, and in 1980, right before I left for the US, one of the male chimpanzees was murdered by two other males. He was killed by two other males. And this affected me very deeply, because first of all, I liked the male who was killed. It was a very nice male. And also I was very shocked that my chimpanzees could do such a thing. And at that time we did not know much about chimpanzee behavior, and in the field a few incidents had been observed, but not much. And so people said, well, this is maybe because of captivity that they kill each other. But now we know that actually in the wild the chimpanzees do the same thing. But I was extremely shocked by that incident. And
it was very violent, right?
It was very violent.
As I remember, you wrote about it. Right?
I wrote about it several times, yeah. And then as a result of that, I decided I need to look at conflict resolution and cooperation more than at aggression. Because everyone was studying aggressive behavior, and I thought, well, if they don't resolve their conflicts, then this kind of stuff happens. These very terrible incidents may happen. So I realized how important conflict resolution is, and decided the rest of my career I'm going to spend on positive behavior and empathy and conflict resolution. And now, of course, that is quite an accepted direction. There's many people who do that now. But at the time, people considered me a romantic. I was a romantic because I wanted to study conflict resolution and I wanted to study empathy. They did not take that seriously. But now it's now 50 years later, now it's taken seriously.
Yes, of course. No, and now I realize that you were trying exactly not to be treated or to have the same conclusions of Konrad Lorenz on aggression.
Uh-huh.
No? We are aggressive, that's why we do what we do, and that's over.
Yeah.
No? To take out all the good things that are in primates and in human beings.
But the Lorentzian message still remains today. So still today we have people who write that we humans, we are deep down very aggressive. Deep down we want war, we have war in our DNA. There are many people who have the same pessimistic message of Lorenz still, is that we are an aggressive species, first of all. And only secondarily, we are a nice species or a cooperative species. Whereas I think it's exactly the opposite. We are a very social, very cooperative species. And only when we don't get our way or when things go bad, then we become aggressive.
But do you think that really Cornel Lorenz wrote that? Because, I mean, after all, he insists that we have this Hollywooden's view of animals as violent, but they are not so. And he explains aggression. Well, his book is on aggression, but I think he was misunderstood. I mean, I really think
he was partly misunderstood, for sure, yeah. Because he also talked about the ritualization of aggression.
Yes, of course.
He talked very much about how aggression is kept under control.
Of course, yes.
So yes, we do have an aggressive instinct, but we also have ways of inhibiting and ritualizing it. So Lawrence already in his writing very clearly stated that we have ways of going against it. Yeah.
So maybe we should try to do a new lecture of Cornel Lorenz, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would like to do it. I mean, philosophically speaking, it would be very important because I think that he really didn't mean it. And he was involved in all these movements, so it's very easy to interpret him that way.
Yeah.
Now, morality, Frans. You seem to have found the basis of morality in many animals. I remember that in Good Nature you even talk about bats. Well, what can you tell us about it? What would you say are the basis of morals?
Yeah. So morality is a topic that I started with in Good Natured, which is in the 90s. And that's partly because I was interested in empathy and sympathy and started thinking about it and studying it in my animals. And each time I talked about it, people said, well, that sounds very moral. That sounds very related to ethics. So for example, the Dalai Lama, for him, compassion is the core of ethics. It's the center of our human sense of morality is compassion. And so when I started working on empathy, I always got these questions about morality. And that's why I decided I need to look into the origins of morality. Where does it come from? And even though I don't necessarily say that other species are moral, for example, I'm not saying that chimpanzees are moral beings, I think they have a lot of the psychology that we put in our moral systems. So we, for example, we make use of empathy and sympathy in our moral systems. We make use of following rules. We make use of the sense of fairness, the sense of justice, conflict resolution, conflict resolution is maybe the core of human morality because the moral system is basically a conflict resolution system within society. So all these elements can be found in other species, and I got interested in how humans have constructed morality out of these tendencies. And so I do think human morality is quite unique, but there's many elements in there that I can find in other species.
In other species. Now, you mentioned Dalai Lama, and now I remember once Dalai Lama was talking to Paul Ekman, and Paul Ekman told the Dalai Lama that Darwin would say that the compassion or the empathy to sentient beings, to the beings that can feel, would be the greatest virtue, the greatest virtue. And then the Dalai Lama stopped the talking and said, Darwin talks about sentient beings, and he was shocked because it's a word of Buddhism, a key word of Buddhism. So now I would ask you, we can have empathy for all beings, but does it matter if they think or they do not think? I mean, are we going to make fundamental the fact that they think, or to make fundamental the fact that they feel? What would you say?
Well, sentient is not about thinking. Sentient is about experience.
Experience, yes.
Means that you have inner experiences, such as pain and pleasure. Those are the most basic ones, of course. Consciousness, self-consciousness comes maybe in, but the main part is that you have experiences. And generally we assume that many animals have experiences. if you kick a dog and the dog yelps, we assume that the dog feels pain. And the dog learns from this. He's going to avoid you because, so the fact that the dog learns from this experience means that he has felt something bad about it. So we assume for many animals, since many animals can learn from experiences, that they must have inner experiences. So generally it's now assumed that sentience is present in many species. So for example, there are fish studies. People have for a long time said fish don't feel pain. But we now have these studies that show that fish can learn from painful experiences. You bring them in a situation which is painful, and they're going to, in the future, avoid that situation, which means they must have felt something. So we now generally assume that all animals with brains, probably also insects and
yes,
invertebrates,
there are some studies on insects.
Octopus and so on, all animals that have a brain are probably sentient in that sense. Animals without a brain, or plants, maybe not. So for example, if you take an oyster, which doesn't have much of a brain, maybe it's not a sentient being. But certainly there's so many species that have brains, and so we tend to ignore that, and if you kill a mosquito, you may be killing a sentient being in that sense.
So would you say that we should have empathy to all sentient beings or to all thinking beings?
The thinking is a sort of secondary. The thinking part, and it's hard to define exactly what that is not the key of sentience, I think. So should we have empathy with sentient beings? I think we should as much as we can, given the circumstances. We also have to live. And so if you are in your bedroom and there's a mosquito, I'm not against you killing the mosquito, but still, it's all these animals with brains are sentient beings.
Okay. Now, then what does it imply to have empathy or compassion to all animals? I mean, you experiment with animals, right? And there are different ways of making experiments with animals. So would you say that there is a limit, or there are some limits? What would you say about
Of course there's a limit. You cannot do everything you want with an animal. And at the moment, for example, in the United States, we have stopped doing research on chimpanzees.
On chimpanzees? You
Biomedical.
don't do it anymore?
No, biomedical research on chimpanzees has stopped. And I'm part of Chimp Haven, which is an organization that receives many chimpanzees from the labs and puts them out in large open air enclosures for retirement, basically. So for chimpanzees, we have reached the point where we have said we don't do invasive studies on them anymore. That doesn't mean you cannot do behavioral experiments. Like the sort of things that I do is where a chimpanzee uses a computer, just like a kid, and does a test on the computer. That's different. But the invasive studies where you give them a disease, for example, or you take away part of their brain, that's the things that have stopped. And it's possible that this will stop also for other primates, but for the moment it's for chimpanzees. And I think for all animals, also rats, all animals, we always need to carefully weigh what are we doing, what are the benefits that we get from this research versus the pain that we cause. And do we need to cause so much pain? Could it be done differently, for example? Could we get the same results by a different procedure that is less invasive or less stressful? And that's always what we need to consider, I think. And I always feel that the primates, for example, they should not be used for research that also can be done on rats. And so that we shift research away from primates. And at the moment, there's a very interesting development that I really like for the primate research, is that we can do a lot of the research that we do now without isolating them and without putting them in a chair, because people put monkeys in a chair where they sit fixed and they are in a test. We can do a lot of things now without this. We can put chips, microchips, in the primates so that we can follow them around with a Wi-Fi system, for example. We can do a lot of tests where they are free-ranging where they may be even living with other monkeys. So you put them in a group of, let's say, 10 monkeys or 20 monkeys. And the monkeys are being monitored from a distance with a system that is very different. And you can get a lot of information on their behavior, on their physiology, maybe on their neural activity. All these things can be done without isolating them or putting them in a chair. And I think many places are now moving in that direction. I think all the research on primates probably needs to move in a direction where they can live their life in a social group and we collect information on them. Yes. That's a very different and much more promising, I think, method than putting them in a chair and holding them there.
Okay. Okay, yes. And of course, let's not talk about keeping a chimpanzee inside a building forever, for life, connected with wires and...
Yeah, but for chimpanzees that stopped in the US, that stopped already long ago. So now it is completely stopped, but chimpanzees were used less and less for that kind of research. Yeah.
Well, so finally, what would you recommend? In which direction are you going now? As far as I know, you have written a new book.
Uh-huh.
So what is it about?
The new book is about emotions in animals and humans, because I also talk a lot about humans. Because I think we underestimate the role of emotions in our lives.
Because we are very rational.
We think we're very rational beings.
We think
we like to be rational, but we are not. And I think many of the things that we do are very emotionally driven. So for example, politics. Politics, we think, is a rational human enterprise. Aristotle called it a rational thing, actually. But it is very emotion driven. And we make our decisions for the political candidates, for Brexit. These decisions are emotional decisions. They're not rational decisions. Rationally speaking, Brexit is not a good decision, but emotionally speaking, it made maybe sense. And so we are very emotionally driven, and we underestimate that. And by exploring animal emotions, I show all the similarities. In many, many levels, animal emotions and human emotions are the same, basically. For animals, of course, we know less about what they feel. We know less about their inner experiences than we know about humans. But my guess is that if chimpanzees use the same facial expressions under the same conditions, like when they're angry or when they're sad or when they are disappointed, they must have similar feelings associated with them. That is very likely. And so I think not only the emotions are very similar and the expression of them, but the feelings behind it are probably very similar too. And so since I'm a student of a professor, Jan van Hoof, who is an expert in facial expressions. I was very familiar already as a student with the study of facial expressions. And the facial expressions of the primates have always interested me. And the book is partly about Jan van Hoof because it is, the title is Mama's Last Hug like an embrace. And it's about a chimpanzee female whose name is Mama. And she was 59 when she died.
59?
59. And Jan van Hoof, he was almost 80. And he went into the cage where she was dying and she embraced him. And so that's Mama's Last Hug. It's a very moving video that you can find on the internet. If you type in Mama and Van Hoof, you will find the video. It's a very moving scene. And so I start my book with a description of Mama and her situation and her position in the group. She was very central to a very large group of chimps. She lived at the Arnhem Zoo with about 25 other chimps on a very big island. And she was the center of the group. So even though there were some males in the group who were physically dominant over her, she was really the central figure in the group and kept the whole group together. She was very important. And so I describe her life and her end. And then from there I move on in the book to questions of facial expressions, questions of empathy. How do we study empathy in animals? How do we see it? Are there any emotions that are uniquely human? And I'm not convinced that there are any emotions that are uniquely human. I think all human emotions have connections with animal emotions. And then in the end, I talk about sentience and how we define consciousness and sentience and what we can do with that. Yeah.
So maybe that's a way to end up with the conception of anthropomorphism, not anthropocentrism, but anthropomorphism, but because after all, when science says that we are given an animal the qualities of a human being, what they do not realize is that we are animals and that we can recognize that quality in an animal because we have it, because we are animals.
Yeah. Yeah, so anthropomorphism is often used by scientists as a way of stopping all this and saying, well, we need to keep our distance, we are different, and so we should not use terms that we use for humans, for animals. So for example, if you say my dog is jealous, they will say that's anthropomorphic because jealousy is a human emotion, and now you're saying your dog has a human emotion. I think that's total nonsense. The dog is a mammal like we are, and of course the dog has social relationships that it wants to protect like we do, and we do that by being jealous. And so the dog has probably the same emotions and the same reactions as a child who is jealous. And my assumption is similarity and continuity. And I invented a word called anthropodenial.
Yes,
as the opposite of anthropomorphism. I think there's a lot of anthropodenial, meaning the denial of the relationship between human and animal in the literature. And so the humanities especially, philosophy, anthropology, psychology, all these fields have a lot of anthropodenial going on. And that's why they get upset if you say animals have empathy, or animals have jealousy, or animals may feel guilt. They become very upset about that because those are things that are uniquely human in their mind.
And they forget that we can feel that because we are animals, right?
We feel animal emotions by our capacity of empathy, but in the same way, animals can feel our emotions and are very connected. The reason the dog is man's best friend is because dogs are very connected to our emotions and react to them. So when we're upset, they react to it. When we're angry, they react to it. So they understand our emotions on a sort of physical basis by reading our body language. And we do the opposite also with animals. And so if you work with animals like, let's say, chimpanzees, who are so extremely similar to us in their hands and their face and their expressions and everything else, we read chimpanzee emotions very easily. Whereas, for example, an octopus emotion, that's a challenge to understand what kind of emotions an octopus has, because it may be in color changes, and we are not used to that kind of signaling. So we have trouble with species that are very distant from us to understand what is going on emotionally, but with animals close to us, we don't have trouble.
I was telling you yesterday that Jesus Mosterin, a philosopher from Spain that's already died, but he used to say that philosophy should not keep on walking, should not keep on doing what it does without the help of ethology. So what do you think about it? I mean, does it really have important implications, ethology in philosophy?
I think so.
What would you say are the main implications?
I think the philosophers very often, not all of them of course, because philosophers are very variable.
Yes,
but
yes,
some
very, very.
But some philosophers have a tendency to set humans apart. Humans are a completely different category from animals.
Most of the philosophers, most of them, right.
And that is for a biologist like myself, I don't understand that, because we have a brain, we have a heart, we have lungs, we have eyes. We're basically animals. There's no doubt about it. So everything we do must be connected to what animals do, because we are animals. So that is, I think, the main lesson for some philosophers, is to step down from that position where we are sort of superior and start looking at the connectivity. And of course, neuroscience is helping with that. The neuroscientists are helping the etologists change that position, because the neuroscientists, they study, for example, fear in the rat, and they find it's in the amygdala, in the brain. Then they study it in humans. They put humans in a brain scanner and they give them fearful stimuli, and they see that the amygdala in the brain is activated, meaning that the fear system of the rat and the fear system of the human is activating the same brain areas, meaning they're totally connected, these two. And that's why many neuroscientists study phobias, for example, in the rat, not in humans, but in the rat. And so the neuroscience is helping with this, with making sure that we understand the connections between human and animal behavior. And I think philosophy could learn a lot from that connectivity. But there's many philosophers who are hostile to science. They think they can operate on a sort of separate level, completely separate from what science is telling us, which I think is an impossibility.
Impossible.
But they try to do that, yeah.
Impossible. Now, we know this quite long ago. I mean, why has it not permeated the society?
I think
what has to happen to make people realize that animals feel emotions as we do? Fear, jealousy, loneliness.
Yeah, but I think we have changed. So 25 years ago or 30 years ago, if I would give lectures about animal behavior and biology and the connection between humans and animals, there would be quite a bit of hostility in the general public. People would be upset, for example, if you propose sex differences in the animals and you say a male chimpanzee is very different from a female chimpanzee, because they would immediately get upset by these biological differences, because they wish them away, so to speak. Or people would get upset if you imply that genes and biology are involved in human behavior, because they would have the idea that human behavior is completely cultural and socially constructed. So 30 years ago, people would be quite hostile to biology related to human behavior. Now, this is very different. Now I can give lectures in Europe or in the US about the connection between, let's say, chimpanzee behavior and human behavior, and no one really gets upset about it. So I think people have changed. People are more open to the idea that animals are complex, that animals have very complex psychology and emotions and so on. People are much more open to that.
In your last book, Do We Have Enough Intelligence to Understand the Intelligence of Animals? In this book you say that 100 years ago maybe people was more open to this kind of discussions.
Yeah.
And that later we kind of close to it.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. If you look at, Darwin wrote about the emotions of animals, a big book. That book is the only book by Darwin that was completely forgotten. It completely disappeared and is now, of course, now it's coming back, but it was completely forgotten for 100 years. And I think what happened is we got the behaviorists in the US, Skinner and his behaviorism. And the behaviorists, they insisted that we look purely at behavior. We don't talk about the inner life, the consciousness, the emotions. We just look at behavior, which is fine. For a moment, that was a good thing, I think.
You tell a joke, right, about behaviorists in your book?
Yeah. So they, and I'm not a big fan of Skinner. So they talked about behaviorism applied to animals and humans. But then in the 1960s, the human situation changed. The psychologists became cognitive psychologists. They started to talk about the intelligence of humans, the cognition, the consciousness, the thinking processes. And so they assumed many other things in humans. And the behaviorists, instead of following them, they said, okay, maybe humans are different. Let's let the humans go. So cognitive psychology was okay. But for the animals, they kept the strict rules that they had. And so we got a division. We got a division in the psychology departments in the United States, for example. You have two kinds of people. You have scientists. Still. You have scientists who study humans. And they assume all sorts of emotions and language and cognition, all sorts of complexity in the humans. And you have faculty members who work on the animals, and they are very conservative. They assume nothing. They say we should just go with the simple learning processes that Skinner has always produced. But Skinner was not interested in species differences, was not interested in ecology, was not interested in evolution, was not interested even in neuroscience. So Skinner lived in a completely different world than most scientists do. And as a result, behaviorism is now finally dying off, is disappearing, because it's not connected with the rest of science. But we went through this whole dark period where the behaviorists were dominant and we were not allowed to speak about animal emotions, animal feelings, animal thinking, animal mental life. All of that was taboo. So there was a very dark period, but we now have lots of young scientists. I think the last 25 years, the younger scientists are basically ignoring behaviorism.
And what do you think that Cornell Lorenz had something to do with this change from Skinner to nowadays, or something else happened?
No, Lorenz and Tinbergen, the two main etologists. Lorenz was Austrian and Tinbergen was Dutch. I'm actually from the Tinbergen school, so to speak. Those two were very intimidated by the behaviorists. So they also said we should not talk about feelings and we should not talk about emotions. Really? They were very intimidated by that. And so they became also very conservative. They had a different outlook. They were clearly interested in species differences and in ecology and in evolution. They clearly were interested in that, but they held off on animal emotions and animal mental life. They didn't want to get into that.
Okay. Okay. So what happened? I mean, what happened to stop Skinner's labor, yeah. or to go ahead?
Well, I think what happened is we got case after case, even during the time of Skinner. So during the previous century, there were many exceptional scientists like Emil Menzel or Robert Yerkes, Wolfgang Köhler. There were many individual scientists who said, well, these animals are doing things that cannot be explained with simple learning processes. So many scientists were proposing complexities that the behaviorists could not explain. And this kept accumulating. And then at some point, I would say after the 1990s or so, at some point it became too much. There were too many of these findings coming in from younger scientists who said, well, my animals, they can think ahead, or my animals can think back in time, or my animals have metacognition. They have cognition about their own cognition. So they came up with example after example that did not fit the old school, and that's why behaviorism had to give up at some point.
Okay. Frans, talking about empathy, could you give us some examples of empathy in primates?
Well, the first thing we always look at is what I call consolation behavior. Is that consolation is if someone is distressed, for example, someone has lost a fight, then others come over and embrace and kiss and groom. So they respond to the distress of somebody else. That's actually also how in humans empathy initially was studied. Empathy was studied by asking a member of the family to cry and to see how very young children respond to them. They touch them and they call that empathy. And so the behavior is very similar to what the primates do. So consolation is the first thing we look at. But since empathy is connected to how bodies connect with each other, we also look for other things like mimicry. For example, if you start yawning a lot, I will start yawning too. And yawn contagion is related to empathy. It's not exactly empathy because it's not very emotional, but it's related to that body connection that exists between people and that exists between animals. And we can study that too. We can show a chimpanzee videos of yawning chimpanzees, and then we see that they yawn in response. Now, so that's the simple sort of expressions of empathy, where you're affected by the body of somebody or you respond to the distress of somebody else. There's more complex forms where you provide help to somebody else, the sort of help that they need. So for example, in our chimpanzee colony, we had an old female who could almost not walk anymore. And the younger females, adult females in the group, they would help her. They would bring water to her. She could not go to the drinking fountain because it's too far for her to walk. The young females would rush over there and suck up water and then bring it back to her and spit it in her mouth. Or she would try to join other chimps who were sitting up in a climbing structure. She would try to join them to groom with them, but she cannot climb anymore. The younger females would push her up so that she could get there. So we saw many of these instances, and the literature on primates and dolphins and elephants is full of examples of this kind of behavior. And that's much more complex than these basic forms of empathy, because now you need to understand the situation of somebody else. You need to take the perspective of somebody else. And I think some large-brained animals like the apes and dolphins and elephants, they can do that. They can take the perspective of somebody else and provide actually the right help for them. There's also experiments on this. There's an experiment that was done in Japan where one chimpanzee was in a cage and had 7 different tools. The other one in the cage next doors had one situation for which one tool would be needed. So this chimp would need to look at the situation of the other one, judge the situation, and then pick the right tool and give it to this one. So be willing to give it also to the other one. And they did that, which means that this chimpanzee had an understanding of what that chimpanzee would need, which is perspective taking. So we have now experiments on this also, and that's a much more complex form of empathy. So basically, the empathy level, I think, of, let's say, a chimpanzee is not so very different from humans, because it has both the emotional and body side, but it also has perspective taking and understanding the situation of somebody else.
Okay. And in Good Nature, you talk about the possibility of finding empathy even in bats. Would you say now that one bat feeding another one, because you say that they need to eat a lot, not all the time.
Uh-huh.
So whenever a bat doesn't find food and the other one gives him food, can we call that empathy?
That's always a difficult decision. I think empathy is present in all the mammals, and so bats are mammals, would be bear. So empathy of being affected by the emotions of the other is something that all the mammals have. And yes, food sharing can be regulated by that kind of understanding the needs, understanding the desires of somebody else, and being affected by the signals, because a hungry bat will give certain signals, and they are affected by that. So yes, I think all the animals, all the mammals for sure, and maybe also the birds, they have empathy.
Would you say there is anything we can do to improve empathy among human beings?
I'm not an expert on that. It's on education of human children. I know there are efforts being made to enhance empathy. For example, to bring a human baby to a school with children so that they can look at the baby and how the mother takes care of the baby. And that is sometimes done to enhance empathy in children. So there's all these techniques that people use, but I'm not an expert on how you make humans more empathic.
But maybe just by keeping children a little bit more near to nature and to kindness and to the good nature,
Yeah.
that would be
Yeah,
a good
yeah.
step, right? Yeah. Now, one of the conclusions we can have after reading you is that evolution cannot be applied only to physical things, but also to morality. So morality is an evolution, right? So there's nothing special with human beings in this sense.
Uh-huh.
And would you say that this kind of evolution that led us to morality is a progression, or is just a way of evolution? I mean, because even Darwin talks about inferior animals and superior animals. What would you say? Are we really superior in one way?
Well, that's not a term we use anymore, like superior and inferior. So it's very hard to say are we superior to an elephant, for example. Elephant is such a different being, so complex in its own way.
Yes. You have said a word that is the key, the different being. being different. We are not superior, right? I mean,
yeah, we are different. We are basically similar, of course. So all mammals are basically similar. But within that similarity, we have these differences. But no biologist would talk about superior and inferior anymore. That's a language that comes from the old Greeks, who had the scala naturae, you know, with humans at the top and God at the top and the angels at the top. And then below that were, let's say, the mammals, and then you got the mollusks, and then you got the worms, and that kind of scala naturae, that has nothing to do with biology. That's a human invention. Has nothing to do with biology.
Because after all, we have some qualities, but we cannot do many things that animals do.
Yeah.
So we are just different.
Yeah. So the way to look at evolution is not as a scale that goes up, but as a tree that branches out. That's why we speak of the evolutionary tree. The tree branches out, and you have all sorts of tips of branches. You have the octopus here, and the elephant here, and the crows here, and the primates here, and the primates, of course. You have the human there. So it's one big tree.
Darwin talks about some mistakes of nature and some mistakes of evolution, and he talks about these animals that are blind but have eyes anyway, you know? So do you think that we humans could be a kind of mistake? I mean, after all, we are devastating the world. So
if we go on the way we do, we may end up being the biggest mistake ever made. It's interesting that you mentioned the word mistake, because there's of course also a group that speaks of intelligent design. You know, intelligent design is sort of alternative to creationism, even though it's basically the same. We biologists, we don't believe that animals are intelligently designed because there are too many of these mistakes. So for example, the human back, many humans have back problems because we are not so well designed for walking bipedally. We have started walking bipedally quite recently, and our back is not really well designed for that. So there's many parts of the human body or of the bodies of other species where you think, if an intelligent designer had made that, it would have been better. It would be probably a much better design than what we have now. So what evolution does is tinker and change, small changes, and so sometimes they end up with a well-functioning whole, but in there are many mistakes because they arrive at it with these very small changes.
Yes. So finally, Frans, this leads me to ask you, do you think our existence, animal existence, the world existence has a meaning, or is just a little particular in the universe? I mean, morality has a meaning.
Yeah, you mean
evolution has a meaning.
Yeah, but whether our existence has a meaning? Well, for us, of course, it has a meaning. We experience our own existence, and so that has a meaning for us. But you mean in the larger scheme of things, we are what we call a speck of dust, basically.
We call what?
A speck of dust. We are a small part of the whole. And if we were to disappear, some other species would maybe take our place, or no species would take our place, and we would just disappear. In the larger scheme of things, we are not that important, I think. But for ourselves, we are extremely important.
Yeah. Of course. Would be there anything else you would like to add, to say to our audience?
No, thank you. Thank you for the interview, and
no,
thank you for having me here.
Thank you for being here. You have been more than generous. You know, this is a great university, and we charge no one for studying or for assisting to any event. We are a place in which society moves from one place to another. So you have cooperated very well with us.
Yeah, no, I'm very pleased to be here and to reach a large audience in this university.
Yes, thank you very much, Frans. Thank you very much. From the bottom of all our hearts, you have been very generous with us. Thank you very much.